Hall was a man of untold evil, yet he always conducted himself like a perfect gentleman.
Archibald Hall was a con man and a serial killer that would stop at nothing to get the luxurious lifestyle he desired.
This is just an animal. He can't be human to do these things because he showed no remorse whatsoever.
Archibald Hall was one of Scotland's most enigmatic serial killers, a man of multiple personalities who used his charms to seduce and deceive. Within a period of just 6 months, Hall was transformed from conman into callous killer, murdering no less than 5 people, including his own brother. I want to learn more about the man who became known as the Monster Butler. I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm investigating Britain's most notorious killers. I want to know what motivates someone to murder, sentencing themselves to death or a lifetime behind bars.
The monster butler, Archibald Hall, cultivated a life of glitz and glamour, using names and plot lines straight out of Hollywood movies. The man from a working-class background made himself high society. But to what extent have the facts become lost in fiction? What's the real story behind this serial killer?
One man who's re-examined the case in the hope of discovering the truth behind the fantasist is author and lawyer Alan Nichol.
According to him, he was a sort of potential folk hero. But when you look at his story, it's tawdry. It's not attractive at all. He was not anything of a hero. In fact, he was the exact opposite. I think what makes him stand out is that he only killed people he knew. Most psychopaths kill complete strangers. It's only if you actually knew him that you were in grave danger.
Archibald Thompson Hall was born in Glasgow in 1924 to a working-class family. He was the eldest of 3 children and heavily resented being named after his father, insisting on being called Roy instead.
I think he was brought up by 2 caring parents, but I don't think they acted together in bringing up Hall. I particularly think the mother certainly enjoyed undermining Hall Senior's authority over the boy, and she certainly indulged him as much as she could.
Hall was a keen movie fan, and the silver screen of the 1940s displayed grandeur and wealth, casting actors as suave and debonair rogues, an appealing role to the teenager. In order to achieve his dream lifestyle, Hall became involved in petty theft and housebreaking. In 1941, the law caught up with the 17-year-old and he received his first prison sentence. He was judged mentally unstable and sent to a psychiatric unit, but this did not deter Hall. Influences on the early life of a serial killer can determine the adult they will become. And someone who studied Archibald Hall's teenage years is criminologist Professor David Wilson.
Hall doesn't want to talk about that because Hall, the adult man, wants to pretend that his life is glamorous and aspirational and is something that should be desired. So he doesn't want to draw attention to the fact that actually he's been certified as insane on at least 2 occasions. That part of his history gets rubbed out, and other parts of his history, if we can believe him, are brought to the fore, such as his sexual magnetism.
Hall spent the next 10 years in prisons and mental institutions. He put his time to good use, though. He studied etiquette and learnt about the aristocracy. He dulled his Scottish accent and taught himself elocution. Archibald Hall had become Roy Fontaine, the perfect gentleman.
Hall realized that if he wanted to play this kind of upper class figure that he had to change his Glaswegian accent. He had to soften the accent. He had to become more anglicized. So his first day in prison, rather than changing his behavior, just made Hall realize that if he wanted access to this lifestyle that he craved, he had to change his behavior accordingly.
Hall's determination to gain the lifestyle he desired was never dulled by his time in prison. Resisting any sort of rehabilitation, he formed new strategies of how to make his money. When his mother gained employment as a housekeeper, Hall realized this was a great position of trust within the home.
And of course, the male version of a housekeeper is a butler. And Hall very quickly puts two and two together so that he realizes that if he becomes a butler, he'll have access to a house, access to valuables, access to bank accounts that the owner of the house might have, and realizes he can use this position of trust to abuse that position of trust to steal and to make his way as he would like.
Over the next 25 years, Hall transformed into a professional butler, conning his way from job to job.
How elaborate was he as a con man? Was he good at it?
He would certainly have you believe that. In his book, which is called A Perfect Gentleman, he goes through and describes the various cons that he himself thought up and then perpetrated. For instance, he goes into a shop pretending he's an American businessman, and he carries it off perfectly, and everyone believes he's a businessman with great credit, etc. He also had the scam whereby you go and look at a ring, and he would claim he had a ring made up that only cost £100, but this ring was worth £1,000, and he would deftly swap them, and the jeweller wouldn't notice.
Stealing was Archibald Hall's favourite crime, but he wasn't very good at it. He tried his hand at forgery, breaking into shops and swiping jewels from the rich. But Hall was regularly caught by the police and frequently spent time in prison. In 1973, he met David Wright, a small-time crook who'd have a big impact on the life of Hall.
David Wright was a criminal that Hall met at Long Larton Jail in Evesham in Worcestershire when he was serving another prison sentence. And as Hall would talk about, he sort of fell in love with Wright. Wright was an attractive, handsome, younger man. And of course, within prisons, there's often situational homosexuality. Now, Hall knew how to use his sexuality to get what he wanted. So when Hall's released first from Long Larton prison, and then Wright is going to follow to where Hall is.
Hall's determination for wealth and fine living drove him on. After each stint in prison, his ferocity grew, and he quickly set about looking for employment, seeking out bigger and better rewards.
In 1977, Scottish landowner Lady Peggy Hudson was looking for a new butler. The man she hired was cultured, knowledgeable, and would work for low wages. But was he too good to be true? Scottish journalist Frank Ryan covered Hall's hunt for fame and fortune. You were one of the few reporters, if not the only reporter, to talk to Lady Hudson in depth.
That's right.
And what did she tell you about Archibald Hall? I mean, what he was earning, etc.
Well, she said she had got him through an agency, and she had got a reference from a Mr. Wooten, who was in fact his father-in-law, but purported to be a businessman or some person of authority who could give a reference. So she was conned by that. He earned £20 a week, which was very low even then, and she asked him why he was prepared to work for such a low salary when he could have been earning money either in the jewellery trade or in London. And he said that he loved living in the country, and he was prepared to sacrifice salary for the life at Kirtleton.
But for Conman Hall, it wasn't a sacrifice, it was all part of his plan.
What about the interesting relationship between Archibald Hall and Lady Hudson? I mean, he was going to rob her, wasn't he?
Yes, I think so. And he was also organising robberies of big houses, country houses in the area. But he liked Lady Hudson. He said in his autobiography, written in jail, A Perfect Gentleman, that he had sex with her, just for charity, he said. But that could be boastful, you know, because he was very prone to fantasy and boasting.
The Monster Butler was in position and had set up the perfect con.
Archibald Hall was out to make a killing. I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm re-examining the case of the con-man turned murderer called the Monster Butler. By the age of 53, Archibald Hall had been in prison 10 times for theft, forgery and possession of firearms. He was obsessed with fame and fortune. He would do anything to obtain the Hollywood lifestyle he so desired.
Archibald Hall had gained employment working for Scottish landowner Lady Peggy Hudson. He'd smoothed his way in as her butler and made himself her perfect gentleman. Hall's young lover from prison, David Wright, had been released and decided to join him in Scotland. Lady Hudson took an instant liking to Wright and he became her odd job man. This proved a problem for Conman Hall.
Wright knows that Hall really isn't a butler, but somebody who's going to steal from Lady Hudson. So quite clearly there was tension between the two of them from a very early stage. And that tension, it mounts and mounts until eventually, according to Hall, Wright stole a diamond ring from Lady Hudson that Hall then has to get back and replace before Lady Hudson realizes what has happened.
Their relationship reached a crisis point when Wright returned after a night of heavy drinking and fired a shot into Hall's headboard as he slept. He then hit Hall around the face with his pistol, causing his lover to bleed. Wright begged for forgiveness. Hall decided enough was enough.
Solicitor Len Murray heard firsthand what happened next from the Monster Butler himself.
The following day, out they went shooting rabbits. Wright with a shotgun and Hall with a .22 rifle. Hall counted very carefully the number of shots that Wright had in his gun. He had a total of 8. And when he had made sure that 8 had gone, he lifted his .22 and pointed it at a rabbit and gradually swung it round and shot Wright in the head. And he shot him not once, but he shot him 4 times. 1 in the head, and then 3 more in his torso. An extraordinarily cold killing.
At the age of 53, Conman Hall had committed his first murder.
What they do know for certain is he took Wright's body, he placed it beside a stream, he covered it with clods of earth, and he kept going back and covering it up and covering it up, and he ended up taking Lady Hudson's Labrador for walks just to see if the dog could detect there was a body there, and eventually the dog didn't even notice.
Hall explained Wright's disappearance by informing Lady Hudson that the young man had been offered a permanent position in Torquay and had left. Hall, it seemed, had got away with killing his lover.
He remained as Lady Hudson's butler for some time, but by that time she had her doubts about him, and she had local policemen check him out. He was given a police escort from the premises, and he ended up in a hotel in Gretna that night.
Undeterred, Hall continued with his criminal ways. He travelled to London and conned his way into another job as a butler for the wealthy elderly couple, the Scott Elliots. Once again, someone else had fallen for Hall's perfect gentleman act. Professor David Wilson has invited me to find out how and why so many people were caught out by the effectiveness of Hall as a conman.
Fred, con artists rely on their powers of persuasion, their charm, their ability to seduce you, and their confidence to carry the con off. Now, what I'm set up for you today is just a little experiment to see if you can work out who the con artist is and who's telling the truth. You're going to meet 5 guests. One of these guests is a multi-millionaire. They have their own food business. They made their first million by the age of 18. And I want you to ask them a few questions to see if you can determine who's telling the truth and who's telling you a lie. Okay, let's have the first guest come in to meet you. Hello, Lucy. Please have a seat.
Hello.
Now, Lucy, Fred's going to ask you 1 or 2 questions. Fred.
What do you do for a living?
I make natural food products, originally recipes by my grandmother, and I sell them in the UK in supermarkets here, and I've just started selling them in Australia as well.
Let's have our second guest who's going to meet you.
What do you do for a living?
We run a food business. It's an old recipe handed down from my grandma.
What sort of recipe?
It's for curry sauce.
Is this becoming more complex
Yes,
for
it
you?
is.
Because when I say multi-millionaire, have you got some stereotypes in your head?
You kind of build a picture of what a millionaire might look like, and of course, that needn't necessarily be the case at all.
I own a jam company called Super Jam.
A jam company?
Yeah.
How did this start?
It started when I was 14 years old, and my grandmother taught me how to make jam one afternoon, and I started making it as a hobby and selling it to the neighbours and at farmers' markets, and now we supply all the big supermarkets.
Where are you based?
We're based in Edinburgh.
I run the Hawthorne Company, which produces organic chutneys that use the finest natural ingredients.
Where are you based?
We're based in North Hertfordshire.
How many people do you employ?
We employ 20.
Right, where are you based?
I'm based in the northwest.
In the northwest?
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
Up in a little village up there.
What's it called?
It's called Darwin.
Where's it near?
It's near Blackburn.
You've met our 5 guests. Tell me about them. What did you think of the 5 people that you met? Who's your money on, do you
My
think?
money, in fact, is on the gentleman I met with the homemade curries.
Why have you chosen VJ?
VJ just seemed to me to live the part. He felt to me the real thing. There was a confidence about him. There was a sort of knowledgeable thing about him. To me, he just fitted the bill.
So when I say multi-millionaire, do you mind gender? Is it going to be a man as opposed to a woman? Is it going to be somebody who's Afro-Caribbean or Asian, or as opposed to somebody who's white, somebody who's middle-aged, or somebody who's young?
Yes. No, I mean, it could literally be any one of these 5.
But you're still sticking with VJ?
I'm sticking with my man.
Okay. Well, Fred, VJ is not our multi-millionaire.
I never liked VJ.
And therefore, let me give you a second guess.
My second guess, then, is going to be the gentleman in the middle, the young man in the middle. I've just got a funny feeling about him.
Well, Fred,
Yes.
Fraser is a multi-millionaire.
Wow. It's incredible. And all thanks to your grandmother.
Yeah, yeah, she's delighted to see it all take off, and she still goes into the supermarket and rearranges the jars and makes sure they're all facing the front. And
Incredible. Great success story. Congratulations to you. Archibald Hall's trick of the trade was he looked the part, he was very smart and he talked the talk, but you don't even have to be that anymore, do you?
No, I think obviously cultures change from the 50s and 60s. People who wore a uniform in the 1960s had authority. Now when people wear a uniform, we tend to think of them in a service capacity. So Hall was playing on stereotypes. When somebody said that he was living the high life, he had to wear a suit like Matt, he had to have his shoes polished. Nowadays, look, Fraser's our company owner who's a multimillionaire, very casually dressed. So we're playing with stereotypes all the time. But the key thing was, if you're a con artist, you deliver those cons with confidence. You have to be persuasive, you have to use charm, you have to be believable.
And after 40 years of practicing as a con artist, Archibald Hall had his act well polished. In November 1977, he'd worked his way into the lives of Mr. Walter Scott Elliot and his wife Dorothy. His position as butler would give him access to their prized valuables.
They were very wealthy people. He was a former MP, and she was Indian by birth, the daughter of a very wealthy Indian merchant. And when he went to London, he met up with Mary Coggles, Belfast Mary as she was known. And Mary had been a lady whose virtue was comparatively easily overcome by money, if I may put it that way. And she introduced him to Michael Kitto.
Michael Kitto was a small-time crook from London who drifted from job to job. He'd been in prison 3 times when he met Hall in 1977. Hall was looking for his next con. Kitto was in awe.
Hall had only been working at the Scott Elliots for a month when he and Kitto went out one night to discuss how they were going to rob the elderly couple. But their best-laid plans went awry when they returned to the Scott Elliot house looking for more wine.
They went and raided the fantastic wine cellar the Scott Elliots had. And the way down, Mrs. Scott Elliot, unexpectedly, they thought she was out, came to the door, and she asked what was happening. And Hall said that Kitto sprang forward, assaulted the lady, she fell, and she was found to be dead.
Another con and another murder.
Hall dreamt of ending his days with one big job, courtesy of the Scott Elliots. But his plans for a luxury retirement went horribly wrong. Archibald Hall, the Monster Butler, now faced another dilemma, disposing of a second murder victim, Mrs. Dorothy Scott Elliot. I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm retracing one of the most macabre murder stories of the 20th century, that of Scottish killer Archibald Hall.
At the age of 53, Hall had killed his first victim, David Wright, a 30-year-old conman. Only 5 months later, Hall's latest plan to rob his new employers, the Scott Elliots, had gone very wrong. In December 1977, Hall and his accomplice Michael Kitto had killed Mrs. Dorothy Scott Elliot. There was now a second body to dispose of.
You know, if it wasn't so sad, it would almost be like an Ealing comedy. They decide that what they're going to do with Mrs. Scott Elliot is take her body in the boot of a rented car to Scotland and dump it. And they're going to drug Walter Scott Elliot so that he's not really fully compos mentis of what's going on. They're going to have Mary Coggle dress up in Dorothy Scott Elliot's clothes, and in particular her mink coat, and she's going to pretend to be Walter Scott Elliot's wife.
Hall, Kitto and Coggle had kidnapped Walter Scott Elliot, the 82-year-old former MP. His wife, Dorothy, had just been murdered, and now, unaware of his fate, he faced a terrifying journey to Scotland, where they intended to dispose of her body.
He became a hostage to them, and I think that's one of the cruelest parts of Hall's story. He paid the bills when they stayed over, and there were several days went by where they had him with them, and they kept him drugged up. Hall decided that at some point they would have to kill him. Now, Hall tries to rationalise this by saying we had no alternative, but when you look at this story, it doesn't really hang together. He was enjoying having his former employer as a hostage. He was like a sort of trophy.
Walter Scott Elliot was now more than 500 miles from his home in London. He'd become a liability for the murderous pair. It was time for him to be disposed of. In this remote Scottish landscape, Hall and Kitto killed again.
One version is that he wanted to get out the car to relieve himself. And he went down just off the road. And Hall came down and tried to strangle him. Now, this is an old man in his 80s who was suffering from pretty extreme Alzheimer's. But it would appear as though he put up an enormous fight. And he was too strong for Hall on his own, and Hall had to summon Kitto. And Kitto got a spade from the boot and walloped Scott Elliot over the head and killed him virtually instantly.
A third brutal murder. Walter Scott Elliot had been killed just days after his wife, his body abandoned in Glenafric in Scotland. Mary Coggle, the 51-year-old from Belfast, enjoyed impersonating the wealthy Mrs. Scott Elliot and remained naively oblivious to the actions of her fellow criminals, Hall and Kitto.
It's a puzzle, because Mary Coggle was living a bit of a dream here, because she was going about wearing Dorothy Scott Elliot's hugely expensive mink coat. She was wearing a wig. She was wearing the fantastic jewellery that Mrs. Scott Elliot had. And that's all that mattered to Mary. I don't think she realised the danger she was in.
According to Hall, he became really annoyed that Mary Coggle was wearing Mrs. Scott Elliot's mink coat. He felt this was drawing attention to Mary Coggle in the towns and villages in Scotland that they were passing through. Hall claimed that she simply couldn't carry that kind of act off, and therefore became increasingly concerned that she was drawing attention to them. Hall again claims that he was going to kill Mary Coggle quite quickly, but again, here's part of the sexual magnetism that he always claims for himself. She persuades Hall to have sex on the mink coat in front of a fire, and that, therefore, according to Hall, meant that he felt he should let her live. In any event, that kind of change of heart about not killing her doesn't last very long, and then eventually he's going to take a poker to her head. Kitto comes from behind her and holds her, and then they put a plastic bag over her head so as to suffocate her, even after hitting her with the poker.
51-year-old Mary Coggle was dead. Kitto and Hall then dressed their accomplice up in men's clothing and dumped her in this stream here. The murderous duo quickly left Scotland, heading south to Hall's sisters for Christmas in Staffordshire.
Would Hall, do you think, from what you know of him, have felt remorse for her death, and indeed any of the other deaths?
No. Throughout my dealings with him, one of his trademarks, if you like, was the fact that he never at any time displayed any kind of remorse. And it was almost as though he was boasting of what he had done.
On Christmas Day 1977, a 29-year-old policeman, Alan Place, was called to Middleby in Scotland, where a woman's body had been found. He was given the job of securing the area for CID.
My wife and the kids, they were small at the time, we just sat down to a Christmas lunch when the phone rang. This was the office. A woman's body's been found in a wee burn between Middleby and Waterbeck, so it was all hands to the pump. So we all collected at Lockerbie Police Station and then made our way to the locus of this body.
What scene did you see down there?
When we arrived here, the body was actually just down almost in the culvert, as if it had just been tipped over. So, I mean, all you could see was the body of what appeared to be a female.
Was it a shocking scene? Was it one that stuck in your mind?
It sounds callous, but it was just another body. It wasn't a gruesome thing. She hadn't been battered to pieces. It was just a body that had some head and facial injuries. But other than that, it would have been difficult to say without post-mortem to see how she died.
But he made no effort to cover the body over down there?
None whatsoever.
Why?
Well, I think it would be an opportunist. He would come along here. Where he had killed her, we don't know. But presumably put her in the boot of a car and come along here, saw the road was quiet, quickly stopped, out across the bridge parapet, and that would have been it. He'd have been off in case anybody did come.
The Scottish police had a body with no name and no clue as to the killer. Hall, unaware of their discovery, met up with his younger brother, Donald.
Donald Hall was Archibald's younger brother. He'd followed in his brother's criminal footsteps and had just been released from prison, having served 3 years for burglary. But that's where the similarity ended. Donald was unkempt and filthy in appearance, quite different to Archibald, the perfect gent.
Hall's brother, Donald, was the complete antithesis of Hall. He was a scruffy individual, long hair, thought to be a paedophile, and Hall just couldn't stand the sight of him. And things got worse when Donald said he wanted part of the action. He wanted to get in on these raids that he was convinced Hall was planning.
Hall and Kitto took Donald back to a cottage they were renting in Cumbria, where they enjoyed a night of fine dining and drinking. On the second night, Donald became overexcited about the intended burglary of Lady Hudson and insisted he would be an asset to them.
He boasted to them of how you could tie a person up and render them absolutely incapable of any resistance by a very simple method of tying arms and legs. Put the person on the front and tie the arms behind the back and bend the legs up. And so Donald put himself in that position to demonstrate, and Hall and Kitto tied him up in the way that he suggested. And then his brother, Roy, soaked a cloth with chloroform and smothered him. I think it's the only chloroform murder in the UK.
Hall, not intent with just smothering his brother with the chloroform, then poured the substance down Donald's throat, killing him.
Hall would let nothing and no one stand in the way of achieving his dream of a luxury lifestyle. Donald Hall had become the Monster Butler's 5th victim and just another body to be disposed of. I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm re-investigating the horrific crimes of Archibald Hall, the man more commonly known as the Monster Butler.
By January 1978, conman turned murderer Hall had killed 5 people in just 7 months. The latest victim, Donald, Hall's younger brother, had yet to be disposed of. The Scottish police had discovered the body of his 4th victim, Mary Coggle, but had no clue as to the killer. Hall's criminal plans to make a fortune weren't working. His dream of living the Hollywood lifestyle was fading fast. He and his accomplice, Michael Kitto, made a plan.
They hire a car. He tells Kitto, change the number plate on the car because 3 of the numbers are 999, and Hall thinks that's very unlucky. So Kitto did change the number plate, so the number plate and the tax disc, the road tax license, aren't going to match. So they have Donald Hall in the back of the car, they drive back to Scotland, they book into a hotel, they claim they're about to emigrate to Australia.
Hall's glib attitude normally got him out of difficult situations, but there was something about his attitude that the hotel owner didn't like. And he just thought he was too glib, and he suspected that they were about to commit some sort of board and lodgings fraud. And he spoke to his wife, and she didn't like the look of them either, and he called the local police. Now, the police turned up, they looked at the Granada that he was driving, and they found out that the tax disc didn't match up to the number plate.
Hall and Kitto were arrested and taken for questioning, while the dead body of Hall's brother Donald was still in the boot of the car.
Had Kitto and he kept their nerve, then they might have simply walked away half an hour later, gone back to their dinner or gone back to the hotel. When Kitto realised the situation he was in, his nerve went. In the meantime, Hall, who was very good at escaping, that's one thing he was excellent at, he threw away all the incriminating stuff in his pockets, he flushed them down the toilet, he jumped out the window in the police office, and I think that's when the police took the car to the police station and as a routine decided to just check what was in it, and then to their horror found there was a body.
Hall was soon recaptured, but faced with the daunting prospect of prison, he swallowed some pills he'd hidden about his person. He was taken to Edinburgh Hospital and treated quickly. Archibald Hall and Michael Kitto were under arrest, but the true extent of their crime spree was still unknown.
Tell me about your first meeting with Archibald Hall, also known as Roy Fontaine.
He was brought to Lockerbie for questioning with regards to various murders, etc., that had been happening in the area. I was one of the officers given the task with the job of looking after him while he was being interviewed.
Were you handcuffed to him?
I handcuffed to him all the time, even as far as being in the cell, having meals, etc. You sat beside him with him, handcuffed to you. So.
What was he like? Can you describe him to me?
Very well dressed and very well spoken, a sort of educated English accent, but every now and again you got the wee bit Glasgow coming through in him, you know.
In London, police officers received a tip-off from an antique dealer about some stolen silver belonging to the Scott Elliots. The police discovered the elderly couple's home had been ransacked. Walter and his wife Dorothy were missing.
He didn't tell many lies, but he didn't tell much truth either. His attitude sort of was, he wasn't sort of against the police, but his attitude was that, well, you tell me who I've murdered and I'll tell you whether you're right or not, and I'll tell you where I've put them.
Police officers in Scotland started the search for the bodies. Mr. Walter Scott Elliot was found on the 18th of January, 1978. 3 days later, Hall gave up information on his first victim, David Wright. He was taken to the Kirtleton estate to show police where his body was hidden.
You were there when Wright's body was found.
Yes, I can always remember it was a terribly cold, it had been a long cold spell, and it was a right snowy day, and we were showing where the body was, and a whole team of us, and of course the chief constable was there. We went to the place which had been described and shown to us indeed by Hall, and we excavated the body off Wright, which was quite something as he'd been buried for a wee while, and he was then taken back obviously to the mortuary.
He was in a bit of a state.
It was a bit of a state, aye. Not a pleasant job. We carried him actually on an old door. We didn't have a stretcher, so he was rolled onto an old door that we found on the Kirtleton estate, and he was carried unceremoniously back to Kirtleton, where he was put in the back of a recovery vehicle.
On the 23rd of January 1978, Hall took the police to the location of the last body, that of Mrs. Dorothy Scott Elliott. Archibald Hall's reign of terror had ended. On the 2nd of May 1978, Hall and Kitto appeared at the High Court in Edinburgh, charged with the murders of David Wright and Walter Scott Elliott. Both were found guilty. Hall was given 2 life sentences, Kitto was given 1 life sentence. Hall and Kitto were then due for sentencing in England for the murders of Mary Coggle, Dorothy Scott Elliott and Hall's brother, Donald. Len Murray was Hall's solicitor for the Scottish trials.
It became perfectly obvious from the start he wasn't going to contest it, and he was going to hold his hands up and plead guilty. And that day was Kitto's birthday. And in the High Court, he turned from the dock as they were going to be led downstairs, and he turned to the press benches, and I was sitting just a few feet away, and he said to the press, "Ah, well, life begins at 40. An extraordinary thing to say."
Hall and Kitto's English sentencing was held on the 1st of November 1978 at the Old Bailey. Hall received a further 2 life sentences for the murder of Mary Coggle and Donald Hall, but denied Mrs. Scott Elliott's murder. It was recommended Michael Kitto serve at least 15 years and Hall serve life.
What were your feelings for this chap that you'd been handcuffed to?
It was more amazement than anything else. You know, bad enough murdering one person, but once the whole thing had unravelled itself, you thought, my God, this is just an animal. He can't be human to do these things, because he showed no remorse whatsoever.
As the years passed by, Hall was moved from prison to prison and became resigned to the fact he would never be released. During this time, he penned 2 autobiographies, retelling his life story in the style of a Hollywood adventure movie.
When investigating the circumstances of this story, for the first time in my life, I watched a film called Raffles with David Niven in it, and you could see Hall shining through. And when you look at the way Hall acted, I think he used that as a sort of template for his life. And he was astonished that people didn't regard him as David Niven or Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief.
Hall really did think of himself as a cut above the rest, as somebody who was sexually dynamic, sexually magnetic to both genders. Hall lived a fantasy life. But the tragedy is, of course, that Hall ultimately also had some deep-seated psychopathy. Hall is somebody who's going to seduce people so as to take things from them. And sometimes that involved taking their lives. This is not a nice man.
Michael Kitto served his time and has since been released, though no one's quite sure where he is today. In 2002, Archibald Hall died of a stroke at the age of 78 at Kingston Prison in Portsmouth.
He had a shocking record for theft. You know, by the time he died, he had been sentenced to a total of 81 years imprisonment, plus 2 life sentences, plus 3 committals to a psychiatric hospital. Looking back on it now, it was quite the most extraordinary case. Perhaps for all the wrong reasons, he was probably one of the most unforgettable characters I ever met.
There's a saying that money is the root of all evil, and never was that more the case than with Archibald Hall, the Monster Butler. He committed forgery, theft and murder. He even killed his own brother in order to obtain the luxurious lifestyle he so desired. In the end, his relentless greed came to nothing as far as he was concerned. He ended up with what he deserved: a lifetime behind bars.